Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Chief with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Our agency investigates complaints of civil rights discrimination. We ensure all people can access county government services in the language of their preference. We combat human trafficking around the region, and we create opportunities to build understanding across diverse peoples and for learning on social justice and human rights matters. With me today as co-host are Tiana Davis, the outreach specialist with the Office of Human Rights, and Dr. Audrey Lau, adult and senior services specialist with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. Lunch and Learn, a joint partnership between the Office of Human Rights and the library system, debuted this summer, and it has been a complete delight. We are honored to have been joined by such incredible guests, and I'm excited to introduce you all now to Bianca Andrews. Bianca is a doctoral candidate in the Urban and Regional Planning and Design program at the University of Maryland, College Park. In addition to her academic work, Bianca is a licensed social worker and received her master's degree in social work from the Catholic Universities of America. She also holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and a bachelor's degree in psychology, which she obtained from Trinity Washington University. Blending these people-focused skill sets with her research interest, Bianca developed a framework she identifies as dispossession by design, which she also commonly refers to as the Oppressors Playbook. And we are going to learn all about that today. Bianca has taught advanced planning courses at the University of Maryland, including community development, which she served as lead instructor, and the advanced community planning studio course, which she served as teaching assistant. Her research interests and specializations are in residential and commercial gentrification, anti-displacement, dispossession, public housing demolition, residential segregation, concentrated poverty, Black feminist theory, access to social services and social support networks, restorative and reparative, planning practices. Bianca, we are so happy to have you with us. For those watching, we tried to get Bianca a few months ago, and we're just thrilled that you're able to be with us now.
Yes. I'm absolutely happy to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This has been amazing, and I'm sad that I wasn't here last time, but I'm happy to be here now. Kyla was very persistent in getting me here, and thank you so much for that amazing introduction, okay? So I'm just going to jump right in just to give you a little idea about what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the dispossession by design framework that I built. I chose not to use a PowerPoint because this is still a developing framework. So some things might not be the exact same by the end. But I'm open to questions, and I can definitely share slides with you at a later date. So if you have questions or if you want to know more, please feel free to put that in the comments, okay? So as Kyla give you a little bit of an idea, my research investigates the deliberate dispossession and displacement of Black people from historically and predominantly Black spaces through exclusionary development practices. So that means slum clearances, urban renewal, gentrification, and specifically in DC, you'll see a lot of public housing demolition projects. So while conducting my dissertation research, which actually focused on the ways in which Black women, low-income Black women, were being impacted by the demolition of Berry Farm and how their displacement impacted their access not only to those material supports that we think about like housing, but also those non-material supports like access to social services, and also access to those neighborhood-based networks that they rely on when traditional supports were either unavailable or inaccessible to them. And so it was actually during my studies of Berry Farm and my deep dive into the archival history of Berry Farms when I realized that not only was its demolition pre-planned years in advance of its actual destruction, but Black folks had been dispossessed of Berry Farms before, actually. And so during this time, I realized that my research was actually a part of a growing debate amongst academics that the dispossession and displacement of Black people, specifically from Washington, D.C., was not coincidental or by mistake, but in fact, it was by design. And so it wasn't, as I started to do this research, I realized that it wasn't just about money or increasing economic revenue like many of them had suggested, but the bottom line had become that after slavery and the end of free slave labor, Black people were just no longer seen as valuable or profitable in the same way anymore. And since living amongst them was impacting white people's bottom line and ability to generate generational wealth through economic revenues like home ownership, they fled to segregated suburbs suburbs where they spent the last 50 years building their wealth and planning their take back of the city. So in reports conducted by the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity, it was found that changes happening in DC absolutely impacted the composition of residents, both economically and racially. In fact, from 2000 to 2016, DC was said to experience the strongest gentrification and displacement of any city in the country. And during that time, 35% of the city's low-income residents were concentrated in these areas that officials would then designate as ripe for economic investment after ensuring that it underwent years of deliberate disinvestment that would leave it economically and politically weak in any fight against those affluent residents who could afford to pay higher rates for housing, higher rates for food, and could afford to commute back into the city and buy back into the city. And so now you had this low income population that had been living in the district experiencing all of this economic expansion all at once. And you see them completely wiped out by 28% during this study. And most importantly, the Black population in these areas fell by 23%, while the white population actually grew by over 202%. So also what we were able to find during this investigation into Berry Farms was a lot of other neighborhoods throughout DC mirrored neighborhoods like Berry Farms and Anacostia. And so we did a breakdown of how residents actually ended up in Southeast. And the reality was many of them had been displaced from other parts of the city through other waves of urban renewal, slum clearance, and gentrification. And so in neighborhoods like Georgetown and Foggy Bottom, which were just like Anacostia and Berry Farms, they were originally populated by a mix of enslaved Africans and their descendants, along with freed Blacks. And Georgetown in specific had contained a sizable African-American population since the antebellum period. And in fact, by the early 1900s, the neighborhood of Georgetown was actually known as to be the most concentrated African-American population in the city. And so important to note is that a scholar who did research on Georgetown actually found that over half of the interviews that she conducted with older residents who had been born and raised in Georgetown were displaced to Southeast DC. And it had been a part of a wave of Northwest, Southwest, and Northeast, where displacement through gentrification, urban renewal, and slum clearance had pushed all of the low income, or predominantly most of them, low income Black people into Southeast. And a lot of the home ownership in those areas began to be transitioned to more affluent white people. And so in order to provide a way for current and future scholars to adequately investigate what these efforts to dispossess Black people of their rights to the city look like, I built the Dispossession by Design framework. And this is essentially an analytical tool to help us understand exactly how these tools are built and how they sustain even across generations. So by definition, dispossession by design is a complex and harmful process through which property owners, multi-level government and non-government institutions and systems deliberately neglect to invest in and uphold properties, infrastructure, and services in marginalized urban communities. This deliberate, systemic, and often racially motivated process leads to the deterioration of residential support networks and stability, and it ultimately paves the way for the dispossession of their physical, social, cultural, and economic environments. And so we see that when dispossession by design is ignited, it creates a rooted legacy of dispossession and displacement, where people are constantly in a state of vulnerability to new ways and new exclusionary development practices that affect their communities. And so what we found is in these times of dispossession by design is often done on purpose or deliberately to control and or dictate their constant state of vulnerability in the name of either profit, power, or simply ideology. And so in the dispossession by design framework, we have 6 components that pretty much drive this process. We have 7 components, sorry. We have deliberate neglect, which includes the deliberate act of disregarding the needs, interests, and well-being of a person, group, or community. And while in my research, I specifically focus on Black people. This can be set towards any type of marginalized community group. And so this neglect is exhibited through inadequate infrastructure practices, educational disinvestment, physical deterioration of buildings, deteriorating housing stocks in these areas, in these communities, in these neighborhoods specifically, environmental degradation, limited access to green space and communal spaces, and also limited access to public spaces and public transportation. And so across DC, we find that deliberate neglect was a major contribution to this dispossession by design, because the neglect pretty much paved the way for this ripe real estate that developers could come in and buy at a cheap price and then turn a profit on. And so the next component we have is the survival state. And this state is characterized by the struggle of individuals or communities to meet their basic needs for survival. And it's also a key component, cause, and consequence of dispossession by design. So this specific state arises when individuals or communities are unable to access essential resources like food or healthy foods, water or clean water, shelter, and healthcare to sustain their lives. And it is often triggered by deliberate neglect and the intentional concentration of extreme poverty, violence, and instances where people are displaced, dispossessed, marginalized, or excluded from the formal economy and its social systems. And so this often ends up creating environments that are plagued by violence and chaos, which is the next ring of oppression in this design. And so in this context, violence, though, is used as it's an intentional use of force to power to harm, injure, or kill individuals or communities. This type of violence can take many forms, including physical, verbal, psychological, or structural, and it is often used as a tool to dispossess people of their communities as well. And during my interviews of Berry Farm residents, they found that violence had been used in a variety of ways in their community during their displacement. One, it had been concentrated in that area, and so crime was definitely an issue that many residents faced, but they also had community support and community groups, and they protected each other. But also violence was used as a method by developers. It was used to demolish what they saw as more than just a building, but childhood memories, the last place that they spent with some of their family members. I had many family members who had spent the last 20 to 30 years living in Berry Farm. So they had spent 2 and 3 generations being in that area. And so to them, they weren't just missing a building, they were missing memories. They were missing laughter. They were missing cookouts. They were missing the opportunity to look out their windows and know that their neighbor was watching their child while they was outside if they needed to nap after working 3 shifts. So these non-material supports became an important part of the conversation that was being taken and dispossessed of people at the same time that they were being displaced of one of their basic necessities, which is their homes. And so in order to understand what this process is like, the next component of this conversation becomes serial dispossession. And this can be understood as the repeated process of erasure, where individuals or groups are systematically stripped of their rights, resources, and identities over time. And so while each episode of dispossession may appear isolated or minor in nature, collectively, they have devastating and cumulative impacts, leading to the erosion of these community supports, cultural heritages, and social statuses. So another thing that we found with residents of Berry Farm is that many of them had been displaced from other public housing communities across the city, going all the way to Georgetown. And so as they were dispossessed, some of them ended up in Northeast. From Northeast, they then ended up in Southeast. And so this was now the 3rd or 4th time that these women and their families were being uprooted from the things that they had spent so much time building as communal supports and homes for themselves. And so it really started to make us wonder, how is this design so resilient, right? How is it so resistant, even though you see many advocates fighting against dispossession or fighting against displacement? You see many people working on anti-displacement policies and anti-displacement strategies. And yet this dispossession by design is working and thriving in many of these communities. And so a part of this and understanding this led to the creation of the resilience component. And so in the dispossession by design framework, resilience represents the ability of these systems, institutions, and policies to persist and adapt even in the face of resistance and efforts to challenge them. It encompasses the capacity of these systems to maintain power imbalances, to exploit vulnerabilities, and to perpetuate cycles of dispossession even in the face of opposition. And so when we think about a system that is able to function in that way, we have to think about its ability to resist opposition. And lastly, the last component is resistance, which is also referring to the strategic reinforcement of dominant norms, values, and beliefs that perpetuate inequality, often through the consolidation of power, right? And so pushing certain people out of a community and pulling certain people in gives one back control of the power. Who am I putting in these communities? Do they think the same way that I do? Do they want to be surrounded by the same type of people as I do? Because if they don't, that means that they won't complain when they see who we're pushing out in order to bring them in. And so what we find is that ultimately, even in systems of oppression, oftentimes when these rings collide, it creates two things. It creates a power bomb for the people who are forced to survive in these survival states, right? Because they're already going through these intense inequalities the entire time that they're living there. And so when all of these rings align together, they're hit with that all at once. But what also happens during that time when these rings align together is the system itself becomes vulnerable. It becomes vulnerable to advocates and to laws and policies that are being built and being pushed on the outside, trying to make sure that it's ready for this collision to happen so that it is able to assist those who have been trapped inside or those who have had no choice of how they're navigating inside. They are able to stay inside if the system decides, okay, maybe we don't have to push them completely out of the city. Maybe we can push them to another community, another public housing community for right now. But for some of them, they're pushed completely out of the city. And in those instances where I've had to help families navigate being pushed out of the city, a lot of other complexities occur for them, right? Because in many instances where women have access to social services that may be in DC, they actually have to have those social services cut off completely first. And they have to stay off for a certain amount of time before they are then eligible to apply for social services in Maryland. And so there are many instances where these women have actually ended up either couch surfing, sleeping in their cars, or having to be in homeless shelters until we could actually make sure that all of their services in DC had been discontinued so that they then became eligible for services in Maryland. And telling a mother that you have no place for her and her child to go is one of the most devastating things you will ever have to do, especially because you want to be able to give it to them, right? You want to be able to provide them with something. You just simply have nowhere for them to go. And it's not because it's your fault, but it's because many systems were not designed to care what happens to her children after the displacement occurs. Many of these systems fail to actually provide them with the type of supports that they need to transition successfully into new neighborhoods. And what I also found during these interviews with people who had actually been displaced is a lot of them actually end up in vulnerable positions of displacement again. On 2 instances, the women who had been displaced for berry farms that I interviewed were actively being displaced out of their homes currently. And in multiple instances, it was because they were only provided housing vouchers for 1 to 2 years, which meant after those housing vouchers expired for that new location, this woman was now responsible for paying market rate rent in this new apartment complex, knowing that it was well beyond her means to do so. And so you create a cycle of vulnerability that then leads her to being in a state of displacement and dispossession all over again. And who does she complain to? And so during this research, and I know I'm coming a little bit on time because I don't want to talk to you the entire time. I want to be able to address some of these comments and take some questions. But one of the things that I found that is a really big deal, right? Because at the end of the day, what they'll argue is, well, can you prove that dispossession by design has been happening across DC? And the answer is yes. And we can also prove that it's been racially motivated. And so a beginning of that, right, has started with just identifying neighborhoods like Berry Farms, like Anacostia, like Georgetown, like Foggy Bottom, that have existed, that have used these exact type of methods, whether slum clearance, urban renewal, public housing demolition, or gentrification, to strategically push out Black people, low-income Black people, and replace them with more affluent white people. And so a number of scholars have been looking into this issue, and now we're able to name a few of the places where that go across all 4 quadrants. And this is a part of why I also didn't put up a PowerPoint, because I'm still developing this map that is essentially going to be able to show us all throughout the city how this has occurred. So in Northeast, we found that this has happened in the neighborhoods of Brookland. It's happened on 8th Street, Capitol Hill, Fort Lincoln, Eckington, Edgewood, Kingman Park, Deanwood, and Brentwood. In Southeast, we found that it's happened to Anacostia, and it's currently happening to Anacostia, Capitol View, Congress Heights, Berry Farms, Navy Yard, Pleasant Plains. And in Northwest, we found that it's occurred in Georgetown, Foggy Bottom, Meridian Hill, Reno City, Brightwood, Petworth, Mount Pleasant, DuPont Circle, U Street Corridor, Detroit Park, Adams Morgan, and Columbia Heights. And in Southwest, we found that it hasn't, and we all know this, it has impacted the Southwest Waterfront, Greenleaf Gardens, Benning Road, Buckeye, and additional neighborhoods include the Armory neighborhood around the JFK Stadium. So far, scholars have actively pursued proving that this dispossession and displacement has not just been coincidental, and it was not just economic. It has been racially driven and racially motivated, and it should be addressed. And so with dispossession by design, it gives people an opportunity to use a tool that can point out exactly what type of oppressions are used in these particular neighborhoods and name exactly how they have been used to target specific community groups. And in my case, like I said, I use it for Black people, Black communities, specifically Black women. But this type of argument has also been made for different groups. I know one specific, I always pronounce it wrong, but one specific group is the original inhabitants of DC. The natives that were here first, they used these same type of methods to push them completely out of the District of Columbia. And then they used slave labor to build and rebuild the District of Columbia, and then force the Black people out the same way. And so when you see these patterns of colonization and these colonial practices that we try and say no longer exist, we see that they're still being actively used to perpetuate discrimination, disinvestment, dispossession, and displacement in urban inner cities. And it's usually at the harm of those who are most vulnerable, like Black people, and especially low-income Black women. And I see that we're at 23 right now, and I love the chat because I see that there's a lot of comments. So I will pause there. I still have a few more things that I can say, but I'll pause there just to open it up for some questions and comments. And then I can, of course, dive back in just to pull together a concluding statement, and we can take it from there.
Okay. I'll say this hits so close to home. I have so much family in DC, especially Southeast. And I know we've been pushed out. Like, we used to have our family reunions at Fort DuPont Park every summer. And each year they make it a little more harder to have your cookouts there. And so now we do our family reunions at a different park in Maryland because it's just easier that way. But most of my questions will come when we start talking about gentrification. So Kyla, I know you had a question to start off?
Well, I did, but also I had to stop myself from standing up and giving you a standing ovation.
Thank
really,
you.
I'm not joking. If Tiana had not, I could see Tiana muted. If Tiana had not unmuted, I was going to just be like,
oh my God, thank you guys so much.
Really?
I mean, because sometimes it all makes sense in your head, and then you try to give it to other people, and you're like, does it make sense to anybody else?
It does.
It really does. And so Tiana and I, just to in full disclosure, Tiana and I have a shared document, and the reason she knows that I have a question is because I wrote it down, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it to you right now. I'm going to read it verbatim. I'm going to look over here.
Okay.
And it says, I have to start with the most obvious question. Is this a book? And if not, when will it be? Because we all want copies, right? Everybody in the chat, we're all ready. We're all online. This is your pre-order list. Where are we in the book? I'm being quite serious. Yeah.
We are getting through the dissertation, which itself will be a book one day. But my committee is very, very determined to structure my dissertation so that it is a book. So essentially, we're hoping that when this is done, some editing with the right publisher, you know, getting down to a solid book manuscript won't be a problem. It will hopefully be an article that will come out before we get the whole book together, but hopefully it'll be an article, so at least the framework is out there and people can start really using the Dispossession by Design framework to argue dispossession in other places, other cities, other states, and impacting other vulnerable populations. So forthcoming.
Because the thing is, like, it's so interesting, right? And so it's like, I'm not like, it's so interesting and it's so relevant and we need to know this. And so one of the other questions I had, and this is why, again, it's like, we need the book. We want the book. We're going to do an event on the book. We're going to do a whole, county read on the book.
I love this.
Because, we're ready. So, but it's because it's so important. And because one of the things I was thinking about, and I'm sure you've heard, I'm not going to say anything we all haven't heard a million times. Which is this, like, where is the line? Is there a line? Is it just, I put the word down, but I can't remember how to say it. Obfuscification. I don't know. Someone smarter than me can tell me what I'm trying to say. Where people talk about, like, revitalization. It's not gentrification. It's revitalization. And so when I'm listening to you, I'm like, that just blows that whole kind of twist out of the water, right? That it's that is not to say that we cannot take care of neighborhoods and revitalize neighborhoods. That is not to say that that's not possible,
right? But
often I think areas that have been gentrified, there is somebody out there who's like, it's not gentrified, it's revitalized.
Exactly. So can
you talk a little bit, like, just put the final nail in that coffin for us? Could you talk?
Absolutely. And I think that is specifically why I talk about it being exclusionary planning practices as a general, right? So I use slum clearance, I use urban renewal, I use gentrification, I use public housing demolition, because these are all methods that have been termed as revitalization efforts. And so when you try to make the argument that you're revitalizing these areas, no, you're actually harming people, and we have proof. And so when you say revitalization, I say that means harm. So now I'm asking about the reparations for your revitalization. So if you want to revitalize knowing that it causes harm to us, we want to know how you prepare or are prepared to repair, right? And repair means there's a cost to every family that you harm in your version of revitalization. And in all of these specific methods that I chose to look at, there is clear exclusion of a specific vulnerable group in order to get it done. So slum clearance, we know that there's exclusion of the lowest of incomes in order to get it done. Urban renewal, it's been proven that it targeted Black communities almost specifically in order to get it done. Gentrification, we can prove in certain cities, the lowest income neighborhoods in those areas are usually majority minority or majority Black. And so we can prove it in those areas. And so you may call it revitalization, but once we name your revitalization effort and what effort that actually is, and we see that it's using exclusionary methods and exclusionary strategies in order to get it done, now you are accountable for whoever is harmed by these methods. And so that is a part of why it's important to create a framework, because they will say, oh, well, there's serial dispossession, but there's not violence. It's not mutually exclusive. Sometimes it can be, but if any of these things are prevalent or relevant in these communities, then they must be addressed. And that is how you essentially argue that even arguments of revitalization, there are certain planning strategies that are used to implement that revitalization. And if those planning strategies cause harm, then there is somebody that should be held accountable for that harm. But that's a great question, because planners use wordplay a lot. And not just planners, government officials use it in policy, and language is key. They can change one word, amend one word in a document, and the whole meaning goes from being a legal strategy that I can use in a courtroom to a generalizable statement that has no legal grounds, right? And it's essentially just jargon.
Thank you. Awesome.
Tiana, do you want to jump or do you?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I thought you were about to jump in.
Well, I was just because I had a question about origin. I'm always interested in where, because you obviously have a lot of passion for this, and you obviously have been, really. I mean, you can't speak with this amount of energy without like a core passion behind that. So my question is, you need to write a dissertation. I've written one. You got to love something a lot to write that. So what's the story behind that? Can you share that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually a story I share, part of my research presentations a lot. But I'm originally from North Carolina. I've been in DC for the past 13 years, though. I came originally for my undergrad at Trinity. And then I got a full ride for my master's at Catholic and then full funding for my PhD at UMD. And so, which was a lot of hard work. That's why you see all these grades. And so my family had actually been displaced in North Carolina, and essentially we had been displaced more than once. That wasn't a big deal, but it was a big deal, but it wasn't anything new to us. But when I was in college, I was actually about to start my sophomore year. I was home for the summer. I had a summer job. I had worked at Little Caesars since I was 16. And my family was living in a home where the landlord, he stopped paying any mortgage payments to the bank on that home and 8 other homes. So he was taking the payments from us, but he wasn't paying for anything. And so the bank ended up foreclosing on all 8 of the family's homes, and all of us were kicked out. And my family actually ended up sleeping in their car outside of a park. And I was going to drop out of school, move back home, and help them. And I remember calling the dean at the time, who was actually a soror of mine. I'm a Delta. And I told her, I said, I can't come back. I got to work. I got to help my family. I can take a leave of absence or something. I don't know when I'll be able to return. And they were like, yeah, that's not going to work. What's going on? Why are you saying that you need to leave school? And I was telling them, I was like, my family is in a very precarious situation right now. I don't know how to help all the way from DC. And at the time, I was in school, and financially I was taking care of school all on my own. I was working multiple jobs, taking care of school, because my mom had already told me, we really can't afford, to send you to college. And I said, that's fine. Just get me there. I'll work as hard as it takes in order to make it work. And so let's just say I had a lot of women, amazing women, rally around me to get me to come back to school. And I had nothing, y'all. I didn't have no money. I was giving all my money to my family. I didn't have any money. I didn't have anything. They paid for my housing. They paid for my food. Oh my God. Like, I can't say how much it means, even if you have one person who's willing to advocate or fight for you. And so I came back. I did. Oh my God. Excellent. I graduated with 2 degrees. I was captain of the softball team. I was chapter president of Delta. I was in the psychology club, criminal justice club. I had been in the room with President Joe Biden, or Vice President Joe Biden at the time, on a summit for inequality and poverty. And so these things had really, I started to see that they weren't just happening to my community in DC. And so fast forward, I got a full scholarship, full ride for my master's in social work. And then I was literally in the community with them. So I started working in Southeast. I helped build this program from the ground up. That's why we got the scholarship, 10 of us. We built a new social work program that would specifically be tailored towards alleviating concentrated poverty in Southeast DC. And so it was at that time that I started working directly with women and families in Southeast DC. And I mean, I talk about having to be a fierce advocate. I've had to cuss out my elders that I didn't want to cuss out, right? But I've had to get locked in Virginia Williams to make sure mothers weren't going to be sleeping on the street. I've had to do whatever it takes in order to get mothers housing, family members housing. I've had to get my elderly residents access to healthcare or access to disability assistance, because they were requiring some of my members, and these Black women were, 2 of these Black women were completely paralyzed on the left-hand side because they had suffered from strokes. And they had them living on the 2nd and 3rd floor in the apartment building. One of them in which I had to teach how to walk downstairs backwards, because that's the only side that she has any strength to hold on. And it wasn't until she fell and broke her ankle that they finally said, this cannot stand. Like, We cannot continue to allow this woman to live on the second floor in this apartment building, knowing that she cannot walk on her own. And so during this time, Berry Farms was set to be demolished. And so I had become involved with working with some of the women whose families were being displaced. And in fact, one of my jobs was helping some of the families relocate. And not all of them could, right? I was not successful in helping all of them get to shelter right away, right? Some of them had to couch surf. Some of them I had to put in shelters. Some of them were sleeping in their cars, you know, and I had to make sure that even if they had to be that for that moment, I couldn't let them stay in that, right? And so that made me a fierce advocate. And it wasn't just in my work, it was in my classroom, it was in my art, it was in my papers that I was writing. And, you know, I started to see that in academia, they had all of these opinions, all of these judgments about people in these precarious situations. And they had no idea that there were systems designed to make sure that they stayed in them. And that, you know, even though we wanted to provide services, some of these women did not want handouts. Many of these women did not want anything from us at all, except for help. How can I access this? That's it. I don't need you to do it for me. I can do it for myself. Just tell me where I can find access to it at, because it was simply just unavailable to them. And so there's this narrative that many of these people have used and benefited from by claiming that people who live in Berry Farms or neighborhood like it are lazy and they don't want to work and they don't want to pay their bills and all they want to do is commit crimes. And I think that that's a cop-out. It's a very interesting thing to say when you've given no investment to these communities and into the people who live there, to say that they would not do anything if they had access to that. And so for me, that is where my passion comes from. I've worked with women and children at the homeless shelter in Raleigh. That was actually one of my jobs before I came back to school. I also have worked in domestic violence safe houses here in DC, the Frady House being one of them. But even in those instances, you see women who stay in situations when they're displaced simply because they have nowhere else to go. But that means that they're in violent homes, they're in domestic violent, abusive relationships, and their children are subjected to that. And some of them have no choice but to run. And so that was when domestic violence safe houses like the Frady House were important, right? And that was a place for them to go where they could have support and assistance in finding and figuring out what the next steps. But the unfortunate reality is there's not a Frady House for every woman that's in a violent marriage or situation. There's not enough houses in general for people who are being displaced by the dozen and by the hundreds from public housing demolished properties. And so there needs to be a plan, an accurate plan or accurate way of telling how are they targeting these communities and what can we do to stop them, period.
Yeah. I have just one question, and then I guess we can highlight some of the comments from chat. But so I know your presentation is mostly about housing, but would you say that this displacement is similar to what's happening at Howard University? Like I didn't attend there, but I have seen the conversations around students being frustrated with transplants because Howard is an open campus. Mm-hmm. And so people who live in the neighborhood, don't really respect the grounds. I know there are like fraternity and sorority areas on the yards, and people are walking their dogs and letting them poop and not picking it up. So is what's happening with Howard an example of displacement and like the Don't Mute DC, all of that?
I would definitely say so. I mean, that's essentially what they tried to do to the T-Mobile store who plays go-go music, right? Like, how you gonna move into my neighborhood and then tell me to turn down my music? Like, it's been here before you. And I will say that just an example. So I can't say that I'm 1,000% familiar with that particular Howard University example, but I'm going to give you an example that might be closely associated. So one of the communities that my students worked with during the advanced planning studio course was the community of Lakeland. And it's right across the street from University of Maryland, College Park. So it's in College Park, Maryland. And many of the things that this neighborhood has gone through is one, it lost 104 of the 150 homes that Black people own due to urban renewal. And now it is losing the rest of its homes due to developers who can come in and buy these homes and convert them into student housing. And so they're taking a single family home and putting 7 students in it. And now the market rate in that area is skyrocketing, right? So the taxes, everything. Nobody can afford to buy in because the single family that lives in this house can't keep up with the 7 students that are renting out of this house for $1,800 a piece. A room, $1,800 a room in one house, and you made 7 rooms in there. Nobody in the market as a single family can compete with that. And so the university is also encroaching on this neighborhood because they need to build more student housing. And the reason they need more student housing is not because they need more student housing. It's because they keep over enrolling students. And so they have more students than the number of students that they can adequately house on campus. And so this creates the need to build more housing off campus. And so now you have these ranch style 1-level single family homes next to this 15-story apartment building for students, and students don't respect not having frat parties all night long till 2:00 in the morning when this child has to be up at 7 a.m. or they don't pick up after themselves, or they don't interact with the neighbors, or in 4 years they're gone. And nobody is helping the residents who are in that neighborhood, Lakeland residents, actually fight for the reparations that it deserves and for the restorative justice that it needs in order for the community to survive past this last generation that is hanging on by a thread. And so that, to me, sounds exactly like that Howard University situation. And I will say that not only does this bring up an issue for dispossession of housing, but also businesses. Another thing that happened in that area was that they're completely taking away an entire shopping center that was host to long-time businesses that have served that Lakeland neighborhood. Even some of the owners were residents of that neighborhood, or friends of owners of that neighborhood. So these establishments and these residents have been together forever, and they just displaced all of them. All of those businesses are gone now. And so while I focus on housing, much of my work actually focuses on commercial displacement as well. I helped my professor, my advisor is Dr. Willow Lungamam. We helped her build the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, which was funded by JP Morgan and Chase, to talk about how these exact type of issues are impacting BIPOC and immigrant-owned small businesses in these neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification. And so they're impacting everyone. None of us are safe in these neighborhoods that are being taken away from us. Not the businesses, not the universities, not the students, and especially not the housing and the residents. So Tiana, I think that was a great question. And I think it goes to say how intersectional some of these methods of dispossession are. And this design in itself has the ability to touch multiple realms and travel across multiple institutions in order to cause harm. Mm-hmm. Oh, hey, Soror. I'm sorry, y'all just saw the comments. Soror is in the comments. So sorry, that was completely.
No, that was a good one. I'm glad you saw that one.
No, I'm glad. No, that's good. I have a lot of comments. I'm still looking for questions. Let's see. Here's one. I used to work in Septima Park, located in Berry Farms neighborhood. The displacement affected many of my students' families. This also affected the school demographics.
Yes.
Conversely, we did not receive any students of other races into our program. The affluent residents, attend private schools or schools in Ward 1 or the other affluent neighborhoods. Yep. We got another dissertationer. When I was working on my dissertation, I focused on a similar topic where I focused on the SCOPE program. I don't know anything about that in Baltimore and how it affected residents in the city.
Okay.
Let's see. Brookland, I'm familiar with. I know of a close association to someone in this community, property valued at $1 million, sold and taken at $500,000. No proceeds went to the owner. I know Brookland has really transformed since I first started spending time. When I first moved here, it is a very different place now.
Fun fact, I watched that entire thing happen. I was going to Trinity. And so when I started at Trinity in 2012, none of that was there. It was all housing, pretty much. It was Black housing, a lot of Black residents. And I tell you, I graduated Trinity in 2016, and then I started Catholic in 2017. And all of that development had pretty much been done, like literally throughout that entire wave. It was all of it. The new apartment buildings, Busboys and Poets, and Pizza, Potbelly, BGR, all of it was put there during my tenure in that time. I watched that entire neighborhood change.
You've got a lot of slurs here.
Oh, another one. Oh, okay. Z5. Oh, we accept everybody.
Tiana, you can go ahead and if you have questions, go for it.
Okay. So one of my questions was, like, your focus is on the lower income people, but I'm wondering if the higher income people, or the people who can get a bunch of roommates together, are also being taken advantage of, because I spend a lot of time on TikTok, and they do their apartment hunting tours, and there are these, I don't want to call them run down, but these apartments are not taken care of, even the ones that are a little bit newer than the ones I grew up seeing. And they're paying these ridiculous, or rather the apartment complexes are asking for these ridiculous rent prices. So is this displacement affecting both low income and high income? Or I don't know how I want to finish that question, but
I will say that I understand your question, right? Because you have more affluent people who can pay more for rent moving into the city or moving into these neighborhoods, but they're expecting to get the value of what they're going to pay, right? And that's what happens when you gentrify a place. I'm just saying, like, you're coming into a neighborhood or community that had been intentionally disinvested. They were forcing people to pay less to live here in this type of environment. And now you're willing to pay more. The only thing that changes about you is the fact that you have more money. Their investment in you doesn't change. They still think that you deserve this too. You're just willing to pay more. So I'll push out whoever I have to. If you're willing to pay more to stay here in this same condition, no problem at all. And so you see, most people will actually go in and knock down the whole building and just redevelop something else because of that issue. Higher influent people who are coming, and especially you have white affluent people who are retired, right? So they don't have the same mindset of an entry level or just graduating college going into their career field person. We might be humble enough to deal with that. They're coming from houses that had equity, and they're like, first of all, if I'm giving up my house to downsize, you better put me in a condo on a penthouse overlooking some water. Like, you know what I'm saying? They're not going to accept just the bare minimum. And so it's really about who. You see that younger generations are willing to accept more. Even younger generations with higher incomes are willing to accept more because they're looking for the neighborhoods that has cultural diversity. They're looking for the neighborhoods where they can hit go-go's or hit our clubs and stuff. They just don't want to necessarily live next to us. And so it's just like, you want the kind of environment that our people create and foster. You just want it without having to put in any investment to us being there and being able to cohabitate with you. And that in lies an issue. So even if more affluent people moved into these communities, but were willing to share place with lower income communities, now you have leverage from people who do make a little bit and people who make a lot to say, you need to do some renovations in here if you want any of us to pay rent, or we'll all put our money in escrow. All of us, high paying or low paying, will all make sure you get no money at all until you do some renovations in this property. And sometimes, in many cases, I've seen that is almost the only thing that get people who are just, they don't care about renovations. They just care about getting the rent paid. That has gotten a lot of them to do renovations and maintenance in the buildings because people are now realizing that they do have an avenue where they do not have to pay their rent if they are not living in suitable circumstances. Now, there's a flip side to that, right? Because you can still get evicted even though you are paying money in the escrow, right? They can decide that you are paying rent, but it's not the same way, and you got to go to landlord and tenant court. And then herein lies the problem. How many people can afford to miss work to go to landlord and tenant court? How many Black people can afford to miss work to go to a planning meeting? How many Black people can afford to go to work to figure out what gentrification is happening in their community and who it's really trying to target, or to go to a conversation about the new comprehensive plan that they don't even understand? So how many people are realistically given an opportunity to actively engage in this process? And when you think about that, you can definitely see that some people are being excluded, and they're they're using that exclusion in different ways, no matter who the income of the resident is. And I've seen that some higher income paying Black people also can get treated just as bad as lower income paying Black people, depending on the neighborhood. So yes, herein lies a problem where, yeah, you have higher income people who are moving into these neighborhoods and expecting more, but you can do that unless you're advocating in a way that can get it. You're going to be dealing with the same conditions that that last resident was.
Yeah. Also, you were talking about violence and how they're pushing these people out. But I wanted to mention, since Georgetown is one of your focus areas, another way that they're keeping out, so-called undesirable people is their refusal to have like metro or make Georgetown metro accessible, right?
Exactly. And I will also add, it is not my focus area. It is another scholar's focus area.
Okay.
And I found her research in order to prove my argument. But yes, no, I do see that exact issue, right? And that's another thing that people are doing as a method of being exclusive, right? Okay, you say that we have to let you have access, figure out how to access it. Because a lot of low income people, especially coming from Southeast, they don't all have transportation or cars. So there's no way they're coming from Southeast to Georgetown if they can't get all the way from Southeast to Georgetown on the metro. It's just not happening. And so that is a method to really make sure that people who don't have access to the same thing as people who can afford to have access to everything are going to intentionally be excluded until there's something that we can do to prove it and something that we can use to do something about it. But their tactics, they just get smarter. And that's what this design is also designed to tell you, right? When you think about the 5 and 6, right, of the 7, when you think about resilience and resistance, it's literally showing you that these tactics that they have are designed to adapt. They're designed to adapt to whatever advocacy strategies we come up with, whatever anti-displacement strategies we come up with, whatever methods of protest or resistance that we come up with. They're literally designed to be able to take that in, adapt, and then push out new methods of exclusionary development and call it something different. And until we figure out how to really call them out on that and then call out whatever we think that their next type of exclusionary practice will be so that we can get ahead of it, we'll always be playing catch up.
So, we're the Office of Human Rights, and once a year, if we're lucky, we get, the conference is happening every year. We don't always get to go, but there's a conference, the International Association of Human Rights Agencies conference, which does amazing things. And in 2019, it was in Orlando, and I was able to go. And there was a speaker there who's Canadian, which I'm also Canadian, so that's probably why I particularly loved her. But she was the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing. And her presentation, she was talking about the rise of short-term rentals. So you're I won't name them, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And how they just gut neighborhoods. And I've subsequently met people, like I live now in Greenville. I actually live quite close to College Park, of course, here in Prince George's County. So I see the change, just driving around, you see the changes of losing these neighborhoods, exactly what we were talking about, the Lakeland area. But, meeting people who have moved to my neighborhood coming out of other communities, in Montgomery County, for example, a particular community where I've met a person who has like a 5-year-old child. And one of the reasons they decided to move was because their neighborhood is not a neighborhood anymore. It is just all taken over by, people have chosen to move from, into either their house has been purchased by someone who wants to have it be a short-term rental, or the owner has decided that it's viable to turn into short-term rental. And so there's no kids, there's no neighbor,
there's no community.
Because as you were talking about the student, the student population is there for 4 years, are gone in the summer and not engaged in the neighborhood or community the way that long-term residents do, that also seeing this with these short-term rentals.
Absolutely.
And so I wanted to talk about to what extent do you see that as an additional layer on top of all of this other stuff that's been going on for decades or hundreds of years?
Absolutely, because if you think about Southwest and the waterfront, right? Like they essentially took most of the housing and most of the housing in general in Southwest is gone, right? Like Southwest is not known as a place that now has a lot of housing. It's just not. It's known as a mostly commercial or waterfront district where you can go, you can eat, you can get on boat rides. It's fancy down there. We have all kinds of nice things, movie theaters, things like that. But it's not known as a community neighborhood anymore. When you think of Georgetown, you think of the university, you think of the museums, you think of everything else except actual people who live there and residents who have communities there. And so the scholar who I was telling you about, what is her name? Hold on. 10 seconds. I'm gonna tell you.
All right. This is my favorite, is going to get props.
Yes.
I love this. I do the same thing. I love this. Yeah.
2 books that I want you to look at. One's called The Black Side of the River.
Okay, Audrey, can we get a link from the chat when you get a chance on that? The Black Side of the River.
The Black Side of the River is by Jessica Greaser. Okay. And then the other is not this one. It's called Before Gentrification. And that one is by Tanya Golash Bolza. Okay. Sorry, I meant to say this in the beginning and I completely forgot. But these 2 books literally talk about this exact same issue. And no, you was asking me something about, hold on.
Can you repeat?
Keep going.
Can you repeat the second book?
Before Gentrification.
Okay.
And that one is by Tanya Golash Bolza, Bolza. And she's amazing.
Okay.
But essentially, no, you asked a question and I was trying to answer it, but I got really excited because
I love it. So this is so good. I was talking about just the added layer of this short-term rentals on top of everything else that.
Oh, yes. And so in this book, she interviews the older generation that lived in Georgetown in the beginning, right? So now many of them are older and they've all been displaced out, but they talk about that exact same issue of it does not. When I go to Georgetown now, the man literally said, I'm looking like, what the hell is this? I can't tell who is Georgetown anymore or who lives in Georgetown. I just see a whole bunch of people who commute through Georgetown or who use Georgetown as a stop or a stepping stone, whether it's for school or a job or whatever it is, but nothing resembles what they felt like their community looked like before, where you could literally go outside and see children playing, families playing, cookouts back literally. And they was talking about block parties where nobody was shooting, nobody was getting shot. They were literally communities of people thriving in these places, and it has been completely demolished. Now you have more retail centers and retail stores and strips of commercial businesses, and many of them aren't even the type of businesses that these residents remember being in these neighborhoods. They've even completely shifted. And so you see that for the demographic that was there before, none of the things that are available there now resemble anything of what they would have wanted to see that community become, because it was not meant for them. It was meant for who is there now. And that is a very affluent population that can afford all of those different things in that area and can afford to commute there versus staying there. Yes. Yay. Okay. Yes. Before gentrification.
Yeah. So Audrey is putting links in the chat for people watching at home. I want to let you know what's going on. So if you're watching or if you're tuning in, if you're watching us on demand, thanks for coming to join us. There's some links in the chat for some of the books that Bianca has mentioned. Audrey's also going to put a link to Bianca's UMD webpage in there so you can learn more about her. I will say, you can tell from my tone of voice, if you've watched us more than once, that this also means that we're out of time. But I want to let you know, so I've been watching the chat, and I think you've seen the chat. We definitely want you to come back. We've been asked, the viewers demand. But it has just been so incredible to have you. It's we are not even anywhere near having the full discussion that this work deserves. And so I'm so grateful for you for spending your time with us. As you can see, the viewers absolutely loved it. And I actually want to take a moment and just just take a point of privilege here and talk on a personal level what it is like for me to get to do this kind of work, where we have people like you come and share your knowledge and your passion, the work that you're doing in the community, giving this information to the viewers, but also to us who are in this work and wanting to have an impact, and that we get to spend our days spending time with people like you is like just an incredible privilege. So on a personal level, thank you. And also thank you to Prince George's County government for giving me this opportunity, because it's really a wonderful job. And on that note, also for our viewers, and, you know, we have very active viewership on our Lunch and Learn. I know we have some family members that come, we have just regular attendees, and the conversation and your engagement makes it so rich for us and for our guests. So I really want to thank the viewers.
Yes.
Tiana, Audrey, thank you for everything. Audrey, thank you for running tech and stepping into the tech breach. For those of you watching, we do, as I said, we love your engagement. We've got Lunch and Learn next week. Let me tell you what we're doing. Let me lean over just one second. Speaking of props, next week we are having Judge David Tatel talking about his book Vision, which is a memoir of blindness and justice. So he is going to be with us next week at this time. Tonight at 7 o'clock, we have Prisca Rodriguez about her book, Tias and Primas, Unknowing and Loving the Women Who Raise Us. So we hope you'll join us tonight at 7 as well.
Yeah.
You can see more of what we have coming up by going to civilrights.mypgc.us if you want to see what we're doing, the Office of Human Rights. And please visit our friends, the library, pgcmls.info/events. Because let me tell you, the library does like 20 events a day. Don't quote me on the 20, but it's a lot. They do a lot every single day, and you should see what they're doing out in your communities. It's just incredible. And back to Bianca, like this has been, like, I'm not kidding when I was like, I wanted to push my chair. Actually, I'm just going to do it. It was amazing. It was so amazing. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And I'm not like, if there's a way that we can help, if you want readers for your dissertation, like whatever you need, we are here to do, because like your work is awesome. And I would love to however, you know, we can support or encourage you. We want to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. This has been amazing. You guys have been so supportive. The chat has been supportive. The comments. Thank you to the viewers who just listened. Please, guys, find me. They put my stuff in the chat. I don't have a lot of social media, but I do have LinkedIn, and I do have my website for UMD on there, and that has my email address. So if you don't feel as comfortable finding me on LinkedIn, please send me an email. But I definitely want to connect. If you have more questions, I do not bite. I'm very open to having conversation. And as you can see, I'm very passionate about the topic though. So forewarning to you in advance before you reach out. But
don't
yes,
apologize. Don't apologize. Not for this.
I look forward to coming back. So once this book gets rolling, I cannot wait for this to be one of the first platforms that I allow to do a segment. Okay. That's my promise.
Oh, we would love that. So it's generally, we would love it so much.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, everybody. We hope to see you all again soon. Right.
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you, guys.